That kind of commitment, not that often.
You wrote an S by my thing.
Maybe that was a question mark. Maybe I just didn't put the dot in there.
Mr. Wallace, today's conversation for me.
Oh my goodness, it was wonderful. Oh, we talked about the Anti-Imperialist League. We paired Andrew Carnegie with Samuel Gompers and Jane Addams, with William Graham Sumner and Grover Cleveland, with William Jennings Bryan, and my goodness was that wonderful.
So yeah, I class during A period, I heard Puerto Ricans,
Yeah, oh, we did talk about
hence West Side Story.
West Side Story, yes, because the Puerto Ricans are going to migrate to the United States in large numbers, oddly enough, in the 1950s. You know, at the very time West Side Story is set. So, Natalie, your descendants, Maria's descendants, came from Puerto Rico at in the 50s. You said that's when it was set. You see, yeah. That's not Valerie. Valerie. Yeah, Valerie. So, all right. So, yeah, we did talk about that today, and I mentioned to the kids. I guess that's on. I mentioned to the kids this, that there are 53 questions on the test. Dumpster violation, right now. So I did tell the kids in the 7th, I think, and 8th periods that of the 53 questions on the test, 23 of them are from chapter 27. So the biggest part of chapter 27 is the run-up to the Spanish-American War, the actual Spanish-American War, the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, the disposition of Cuba, the disposition of the Philippines, the imperialist debate, and then in the aftermath of the war, once those issues are resolved, and we'll talk about this over the next 2 days, you know, the position of the United States as kind of a new world power. You know, the result of the Spanish-American War is that the United States becomes a global power. I mean, we were talking about that today. You know, we annexed the Philippines, you know, amidst great controversy, and established the Philippines under basically colonial rule with no intention of granting the Filipinos the same rights that Americans have in the continental United States or other places where American influence has spread. Now, in doing that, we had established colonial possessions. You know, we had a presence in Asia, a presence in the Caribbean, a powerful navy, a huge industrial base. And so the question in the aftermath of the war is what would become of it, right? And we're going to talk a little bit over the next 2 days about, you know, our relationship with China, the open door in China, and there are questions on the test about this, and the construction of the Panama Canal, and there are questions on the test about this. So, yes, I mean, you should read chapter 27 in your textbook, lots of things about it. The first part of the test, though, is going to go all the way back to the genesis of industrialization and economic growth in the Gilded Age. That's where we started. We started with describing the Gilded Age as a period of rapid economic expansion that centered on industrialization. Now, in explaining that industrialization and rapid economic growth, we said there were a multitude of factors that contributed to that. And most of those factors I hope you gleaned from reading Degler and responding. You know, the richness of natural resources, immigration, labor, government policies. But what we said in class is that we were going to focus on one factor, and that was the expansion of the rail network. We said the transportation improvements and the expansion of the rail network in the aftermath of the Civil War is going to be instrumental in promoting economic growth, if not, the most important factor. And we tried to kind of give you an illustration of how expanding the rail network connected to other factors. You know, immigration and moving resources and creating markets, and how all of those things were connected to an expanded rail network. And even urbanization and moving people and others in terms of that rail network. Now, we talked about building the transcontinental railroads and the relationship between government and building those railroads. And not all the railroads that were constructed in the United States. Remember, we said there were 35,000 miles of track when the Civil War ended. By the time the turn of the century occurred, there was approximately 193,000 miles of track. And that many of those miles of track were laid by private companies. They were all laid by private companies. But some of those private companies were supported by the government, and the national government and state and local governments. And probably the biggest way the government supported railroad construction was with land grants. Granting, large parts of land that would be used by the railroads basically for nothing for railroad construction. Now, we argued that once the rail network was constructed, that railroads became an instrumental part of the lives of people. That people were dependent on the railroads. That never before had there been an industry that was so important to individual people. So much so that many, particularly farmers, clamored for regulation. Right? So they said, look, this industry, the railroads, is important to us. The railroad ownership and leadership and management is sometimes abusive in their practices. They're sometimes corrupt and corrupting. And we want some kind of reasonable regulation of the railroads. I mean, the first industry that people are going to clamor for regulation for is the railroads because of the nature of it, how important it was. And so the question became, can they do that? Can individual states regulate railroads within the borders of their states? The Supreme Court is going to say no. And there's a question on the test about the Supreme Court case in which this decision is rendered. Does anyone besides myself, Mariana, Marissa, I'm sorry, not Mariana, Marissa, you recall, go ahead. Yes, Wallace versus who? Illinois. Wallace versus Illinois, which is in 1886. Marissa, do you recall the finding in that case?
That states can't regulate companies that have.
That is outstanding, Marissa. You are surging. You are surging in AP history. Yes. Yes. I mean, what Marissa said is the Wabash decision said that individual states could not regulate rail rates or other things about railroads for rail travel that crossed state lines. Therefore, the only governmental entity that could regulate the railroads effectively was the federal government. Did the federal government pass legislation to regulate the railroads? Yes or no? What would you say, Malay Shaw? You look at your dear friend Joel, and Joel is not forthcoming in any kind of assistance. Look at your friend Christian. Maybe he'll be forthcoming. He is not either, right? So now you're on your own. You are going with no. But Charlie violently disagrees. He believes that in 1887, legislation was passed that regulated the railroads. What was that legislation, Charlie? This is landmark legislation. Go ahead, Antonio.
I'm trying to remember. I don't know. We're talking about the one that's like this called Addams.
No, it's not the same. Yes, go ahead, Julie.
Interstate Commerce
The
Act.
Interstate Commerce Act. There'll be a question on the test about the Interstate Commerce Act. Tell me what it is, Juliet. The Interstate Commerce Act.
It was the first time the federal government regulated a private company.
So it's the first time the federal government chooses to regulate a private industry. What industry is it intended to regulate, dear Juliet? The railroads. Right? It establishes the Interstate Commerce Commission, and the Interstate Commerce Commission is to discern whether rail rates are reasonable and just, and to regulate those rates for the public interest. And we said that this was an enormously big deal. The idea of the federal government regulating a private industry for the benefit of the public was kind of counter to capitalism, right? And this is the first time that it happens. And it happens in response to the railroads. And this is part of a larger point. The larger point is the transformation in the Gilded Age, the growth of industry, the growth of the economy is going to transform other things, like the relationship between government in that industry. Shane is only coming for a short time, and he's seen enough. My goodness, we just started, right? So the Interstate Commerce Act would be an example of that transformation. Now, okay, so the railroads certainly were important. Another example of the transformation that industrialization brings forward is the growth of big business. And we spent some time talking about the growth of big business. We said, look, the economy grows, and manufacturing is the center of that economic growth. But manufacturing firms, the railroads included, generally tend to be large. Because of the capital requirements, the machinery requirements, these firms grow to be large. So we get the emergence of big business, right? And we said that the people who build these big businesses become kind of the premier figures, the focus of the period. Look, in earlier periods, Jefferson and Washington were the focus of attention. In the Gilded Age, Carnegie and Rockefeller were the focus. And what did they do? They built the giant industries that define the era, right? So the people that we talked about, right, largely as kind of the great industrialists, sometimes they are called, of the Gilded Age, the people that we mention are really 3 or 4. Certainly one is Carnegie. What industry was Carnegie associated with? Well, we should know this, in and out. Steel. Wasn't he the owner of that Homestead Strike that we talk about so often? Don't you wish there were 100 questions on the test about the Homestead Strike? We would know that in and out, because I don't know if you notice, I have a particular interest in that. But anyways, Carnegie is steel. Alex, what was Rockefeller?
Oil.
Oil. What was, this is what was Vanderbilt? Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the 3 we put on the board. Go ahead, Anika. Vanderbilt, yes? Railroads, right? Did you know that? Yeah. Right? Railroads. How about J.P. Morgan? How do we remember J.P. Morgan? Yes. Bank, well, you do remember that, the bankers. J.P. Morgan, we remember Morgan from our conversation. We only mentioned him once and in passing. Does anybody remember? Go ahead, Anika. He's the one that bought Carnegie Steel. When he bought Carnegie Steel, he merged it with other steel companies. Allie, what steel company did he create out of Carnegie Steel eventually? United States Steel, U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel had a distinction. Does anyone besides Antonio and myself, know the distinction that U.S. Steel has? It's the first, say it, Antonio. Go ahead, Anika, or not Anu, go ahead. It's the first billion-dollar company, right? It's the first billion-dollar company, which is U.S. Steel. Now, the performance of the great industrialists raises issues. And one of the issues is this: how should we view these people? Should we view these people as heroic examples of the American experience, industrial statesmen, or should we view them as exploiters of human beings, robber barons? And I don't know how many of you chose to kind of address that question. And remember, you had the choice of the 4 on the test. I started reading some of your papers, and they're okay. Everybody did the second one. You know, a few people did the first one, but most people did the second one. And they're easy to discern because they said there were 2 things that impacted the industrial worker: immigration and technology. Right? You know, so, yeah, I don't know. Did you guys talk before that? I mean, because it's a common answer. And there are a couple ones, I only did a few, so I don't know. But I think that, you know, Darius, who strives to be different, did number 4, where you had to decide whether Carnegie was atypical of the industrial statesman or different, which is kind of a broad question. But it really gets to that notion: how should we view these people? Are they industrial statesmen? Are they the best that America has to offer, or are they the worst? If we were going to say they were robber barons, what the critics of these people, what are some of the things that they identified as being negative about the industrial leaders of the Gilded Age. What are some of the criticisms of them? Go ahead, Joel. Greedy, and they exploited labor, right? You know, is probably the biggest criticism, is that, look, they built these great fortunes at the expense of their laborers. Now, I mean, even if you look at what happened at Homestead, you know, and you say that, look, Carnegie and Frick attempt to slash those wages to further enrich themselves, right? Now, most of you defended that as being kind of this honorable part of capitalism, you know, but nevertheless, you know, you would say, well, look, you know, these people in some cases were forced into kind of, you know, difficult wage situations that put them barely above poverty, and at the same time they amassed these enormous fortunes. So they built their fortunes based on exploitation. The defenders of the industrial statesmen clearly suggest that they built these massive economic empires, and that the mass production that they put forward, I mean, Carnegie's mills built the cities of the Gilded Ages and the railroads that transported people, you know, and made it the envy of the world. And so that debate we talked about, and there are questions on the test about that. There are also questions on the test about what should be done with the wealth that was generated. And one of the things that we mentioned in passing was Carnegie's view about that wealth. And he articulates his view in a publication, something that he writes that's entitled The Gospel of Wealth. Right? The Gospel of Wealth. Now, I know we mentioned it in passing, but didn't talk about it in detail. In there, Carnegie is going to argue that kind of for the necessity of wealth accumulation by a few people. Right? Okay, look. You know, the nature of industrial growth is that only a few people are going to amass enormous wealth. They have the characteristics that enable them to do so, the wherewithal, the kind of, you know, audacity, the braveness, the ingenuity, and the result is that they're going to amass great wealth. However, Carnegie is going to say, even though that's an inevitability, those same people have an obligation to redistribute that wealth for the public good prior to their death. So these great captains of industry that have amassed these enormous fortunes is a natural phenomenon of industrialization. But those people have an obligation to distribute that wealth back to society for the good of society. Now, we see that evident with Carnegie in building the libraries, right? The dozens and hundreds of libraries that he builds across the country. Okay, yes, we made this wealth, but now we're going to redistribute it back to society in libraries and concert halls and in other ways, right? Okay. Now, Carnegie also thought that that ideology was somewhat consistent with the ideology of social Darwinism. What two names did we associate with social Darwinism? We associated two names. Go ahead, Antonio.
William Sumner.
Yes, William Graham Sumner, who we mentioned today. William Graham Sumner was an American sociologist who argued for social Darwinistic ideas. Who was the British sociologist? Go ahead, Joel. Yes, Herbert Spencer. Now, Stephanie, if you were to summarize social Darwinism, what would you say it was?
Isn't it like the rich will survive and the poor will die off because they're not as strong?
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea of natural selection applied to society. You know, human beings interacting in society, some have the attributes and characteristics that are going to enable them to be successful. Others do not have those characteristics. And so those that do have those characteristics are going to excel. Those who don't aren't. And those who do will pass those characteristics to their offspring. And this will create advancement, progress. Right? So the progress that America had enjoyed was because of this Darwinistic struggle for survival. Right? So Sumner and Herbert Spencer argue this, and Carnegie is consistent with this a little bit, because he's saying, look, the great industrialists are results of this Darwinistic struggle. Right? But Carnegie alters it a little bit by saying they should give away what they earn. Spencer and Sumner would not support that. Right? Okay, now, you know, we talked about the growth of big business, and we said, you know, the industrialization, the growth of big business, the accumulation of wealth were all results of industrialization during this period that changes the nature of America. But industrialization is also going to affect labor. You know, and we said that one thing that was true is that industrialization changes the nature of work, right? That more and more people who work in factories for wages, right, are going to find themselves in different conditions than they were accustomed to. You know, most people prior to the Civil War lived and worked on farms and had some level of autonomy and security because of those farms. In the aftermath of the Civil War, as factories sprung up and railroads were being built, more and more people worked for wages and were employed by large impersonal companies and performed tasks that were increasingly mundane, repetitive and meaningless, and had a disassociation with the people that they were working for, the ownership, and the final product that they were producing. This change in the nature of work causes people to respond. And if you read Dagler said the response to this, as well as low wages, long hours, and dangerous working conditions, was unions. Now, there had been unions before, but we talked about the union movement that emerged in the aftermath of the Civil War. And we said that that union movement, in some ways, at least at times, was an attempt to organize all working people to pursue goals, mutual goals. I mean, look, there are even things like the Greenback Labor Party and the Populist Party that tries to reach out to laborers to unify all working people against what they saw as dangerous changes and power in society. You know, again, this industrialization is changing things. Now, in terms of talking about labor, we mentioned 3 attempts to organize workers. The National Labor Union, which was the first attempt, which fizzles out with the Panic of 1873. The Knights of Labor, what name do we associate with the Knights of Labor and what objective? Aparna, what name do we associate with the Knights of Labor and what objective? You have an expression as if you do not know. I will call on Ian. Ian, yes. Yes, Terence Powerley. So Powerley is the labor leader that we associate with the Knights of Labor. And what objective? How is the Knights of Labor's goals could be considered radical? Go ahead. Natalie. Valerie, darn it! Now I got Valerie. No, he's not the one that said more. But hang on to that thought. I'll call you in a minute. Yes. All workers in one gigantic union, black people and women included, correct? Which was quite progressive for the time. In order to do what, Sylvia? All people in one union in order to do what? Change the nature of the relationship between workers and producers. Worker-producer cooperatives. Right? Now, okay. The American Federation of Labor is the labor union that exists to this day, the labor organization. How was the American Federation of Labor's approach different than the Knights of Labor? Go ahead, Wormsy.
Didn't they only want skilled workers?
What's that?
Didn't they only want, like...
Who is he? They only wanted to organize skilled workers, and we mentioned him today, yes. Samuel Gompers, right? Samuel Gompers is the head of the AFL, only wanted to organize skilled workers, and what did he want? What was his objective in organizing? Go ahead, Sonny.
So that they could be effective.
What is it?
So that they could, like,
Yeah, he organized them so they could strike, right? So they could strike. Go ahead, Valerie. What was his objective? More, right? Remember, Gompers in the AFL has no intention in unifying all workers in one gigantic union for the purpose of pursuing the goal of the working man, right? I mean, the Knights of Labor, and to some extent, to another extent, the Populist Party had a similar objective, to unite all working people into an organization that would pursue the goals of the working man, that would fight the kind of corporate power that was emerging and defend, the working person from abuse that might come from government and return government to the people, etc. These broad goals. And in the case of the Knights of Labor, they wanted to actually change the relationship between workers and producers. Workers to take over the means of production, right? Gompers had no desire to do any of that. Gompers wanted to unite the people who could do something into gigantic labor unions that could shut firms down if they didn't do it, right? So that they would have to meet their demands for more, right? So they don't want to change the nature of the relationship between workers and employees, they just want more. And even if you go back to my favorite topic, the Homestead Strike, the Amalgamated Iron and Steel Workers, who were the union that represented the skilled workers at Homestead, were affiliated with the AFL. And remember, if you watch The River Ran Red, which we viewed in this very room right here, in this very room on that screen, we viewed The River Ran Red, gripping documentary. One of the things that they said is they'll never get this mill started without the skilled workers, right? That was a very Gomper-esque kind of notion. If all of the skilled steel workers are in one union, then they can never operate steel mills, right? I mean, it's interesting. Automation kind of undermined that a little bit, but okay. So we have the Knights of Labor. The most enduring union, therefore, was the AFL because it's still in existence to this day. Now, Now, all right, so that kind of takes us through chapter 24 in your textbook and industrialization. And now we turn to urbanization. And we said that urbanization is connected to industrialization, to be certain, right? I mean, the growth of industry prompts the growth of cities. I mean, I think that the growth of industry is on some level causal to the growth of cities, right? So we talked about the growth of urban areas during the Gilded Age, and we said, well, look, they grew, yeah. Lots of people came there. Now, we explained that growth as a push and a pull. That things pushed people out of where they were and pulled them into urban areas. Now, in terms of the pull, we said what pulled people into Gilded Age cities were economic opportunities that were enhanced by factories being located in cities and railroads being able to transport resources into urban areas, into factories, and then railroads being able to transport the finished products out to other places and to the world. So certainly people went to cities in order to pursue economic opportunities. And the alternative to the city was the farm. And we spoke at length in this unit and in other units about the problems on the farm. And some of you wrote about that a little too much, I think, on your essays about problems in agriculture and how that affected industrial workers. But certainly problems in agriculture are going to make futures in farming bleak, right? I mean, okay, if my parents own a farm and they are struggling to make it, what makes me think if I take it over, I'll do any better? If I am subject to low prices and variations in prices and pests and weather and all of the things, and I need huge amounts of equipment to competitively grow this, and I have to borrow money, and I'm subject to interest rates from banks and rail rates and other things that are represented in the frustration of the Populist Party, you can see that the emergence of the Populist Party that we talked about in the previous unit and urbanization are going to be connected. problems on the farm lead to people moving to the cities, right? Now, I mean, that's the push. Another pull into the cities, there's a question about it, is the lure of excitement in the cities. The farm was real boring, you know, the lure of excitement into the cities. But we said one of the most interesting features of urbanization of the Gilded Age was immigration. You know, that not only did people leave the domestic farms in the United States, but they left European farms and migrated to the United States. Now, and when they migrated here, 80% of them located and settled in urban areas. Chicago, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, Detroit, Cincinnati, throughout the Midwest. You know, even on the West Coast, immigration explains a large migration of people. Now, one thing that there'll be questions on the test about is the two waves of immigrants. Wave 1 and Wave 2, old and new, right? Old immigrants are the immigrants from what part of Europe? Does anyone remember what part of Europe? Go ahead, Anika. Northern and Western Europe. Now, Allie, can you name one country that would fall into that category? Northwest Europe. What an appropriate thing. What a darn appropriate thing you said here on St. Patrick's Day to say Ireland. Yes, Ireland would be in Northern and Western. We know that there was a huge migration of Irish people as early as 1845 through the first wave of immigration into the 1880s. Germany, Ireland, etc. Second wave of immigrants, new immigrants, how were they different? Dear Jackie, second wave, new immigrants, how were they different from the first wave? Pardon me? What did she say? Now I'm going to ask the Vickers to tell me. This is going to be good. Right? Two whisperers are going to tell. Vickers, what did she say?
A different part of Europe.
There you go. A different part of Europe, darn it, yes. And what part of Europe, dear Wormsy, did the second wave come from?
The South and the East.
The South and the East. Dear Wormsy, you know what you must do now? You must name one country that would be part of that second wave. Poland. Why did you choose Poland? It's a darn good country, Poland. Yes.
Italy.
And my people, right? The Italian people. Yes, a huge number of Italians and Poles and Serbs and Croats and Bulgarians and Romanians and Hungarians and all of those ethnicities, Russians and others. And besides being from, Jackie, from that part of Europe, those people also had distinctive religions. All of them were either Jewish, a large Jewish, migration came, Catholic or Orthodox. These were all considered to be dangerous religions in some ways. I mean, America was firmly Protestant and feared and resented Catholicism. And certainly harbored anti-Semitic feelings as well. I mean, certainly the United States is not going to be as anti-Semitic as Europe is. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean that there weren't anti-Semites in the United States. There certainly was. These people that come in large numbers from these different places for the first time are going to be of different ethnicities, different languages, different cultural tradition, different governmental understandings. Few of them will be associated with free government at any level. Most of them are peasants that are only able to now come here because of a reduction in freight, or in transportation costs, and an ability of communication expansion that connects them with relatives that have come here. And so their migration is going to be huge and distinctive. And most of them are going to go to urban areas, and there they will cluster in ethnic conclaves, Polish sections of cities, Russian Jewish sections of cities, Italian sections of cities, Chinese sections of cities, although China was in Asia. I should mention that the first real immigration restriction is the Chinese Exclusion Act. think there's a question on the test, but there might be. The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 is the first restriction. But this first and second wave and the nature of them, there are going to be a few questions on. What was a bird of passage? What was a bird of passage? We mentioned this. We mentioned the second wave. Go ahead, Antonio.
It was an immigrant that came to like get money and then went back home.
Correct, right? Birds of passage were immigrants that came, returned, earned money and returned. Many of you actually used immigration pretty effectively. Some of you did, and some of you did on your tests. Some of you said, well, look, this large group of impoverished people coming to America for the purpose of making money, and the fact that they had nowhere else to go would, and the size of the people went there would, enable them to work for very low wages, which undermined the wages of labor. That's a good point, right? I mean, it was better made in some cases than others, but it was made, and it's a good point. Now, we said that this huge impoverished mass of second wave immigrants that come and flock into urban areas are going to encounter both nativism. What's nativism? What's nativism? Say it, Malay.
20 bigger countries for everyone.
Well, yes. I mean, the phrase that embodies nativism is America for Americans, right? We don't want these no-good immigrants coming in and undermining our country. This is not a country for Italians. This is not a country for Polish Jews. It's not a country for Russian Jews. It's a country for people just like us. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants tended to be the people who would defend what they saw as American ethnicity more than anybody else. So there's a backlash against this huge migration of immigrants that's called nativism, right? We'll talk more about that in a second. We also said this huge migration of immigrants that come in and flock into these urban areas are going to create problems for the cities, right? Look, here these people are poor. Oh, what was the name of the book and the author that chronicles the problems of urban America in 1890? Yes, go ahead, Mike. How the Other Half Lives. Who would remember the name and the spelling of that name, which is quite distinctive? Does anybody remember that? You should remember this. Go ahead, Barna. Say it. Reese. How do you spell it? I. I'm a poor speller, but it's R-I-I. Maybe I didn't put dot the I's on the board, but it's R-I-I-S. Jacob Reese, right? Scandinavian immigrant, Danish immigrant, Jacob Reese. Marissa, R-I-I-S. Aparna, I threw her off. I didn't dot the I's. She's mad at me though. I don't blame you. But you speak for the row. I need you, right? So I can't alienate you. You speak for the row up there. So, okay. We talked about the hostility, which is nativism, right? And we talked about the problems. And we said, one of the things we said is no one really seemed willing to do anything about the problems these people encountered, except for whom? Who responds? Go ahead, Ian. The political bosses. Name one political boss. We only talked about one. Marcy Tweed. Tweed. What was the name of his political machine? Wait a minute. The vicars are separated here. There's a vicar over here too. All right, now, let's see. This is Danielle. Danielle, what was the name of his political machine? I'll go to Dominique. Dominique, what was the name of the political machine? Elaine knew nothing all day. Now he knows. He was O for the afternoon. Now he knows. Yes?
Tammany Hall.
Joel told you that, didn't he?
No.
Yes, it's Tammany Hall. All right. Tammany Hall it is. Jackie, will you watch the rest of it on your TV? Your computer. Yes, okay. Tammany Hall. Now, how does the problems of urban America lead to the power of the big city bosses? I mean, that's a more lengthy question than I've been asking. But how does the problems of urban America, the immigrant poor? Go ahead, Charlie.
Well, because they had nobody to look out for them, these people stepped in and made it seem like they were really helping them out, but they were actually really making profits for
That's
themselves.
not a bad explanation. I mean, I think the first part of what you said, Charlie, is very true. There was nobody looking out for these people. And the political bosses and their machine did so. Now, Charlie did express some kind of suspicion of their genuine interest, right? I mean, were these bosses genuinely interested in these people? Well, I mean, clearly they were interested in power, electing people, and the graft and corruption that they could glean from their actions, the kickbacks and the other things. But they do provide rudimentary and fundamental services to these people, which, you know, enables them to maintain power until people come along and address these problems. Now, we said that there's kind of two different ways of looking at the problem. One is to blame the people themselves. And one of the things that was representative of that, blaming the people themselves, was immigration restrictions. And on the test, there's something called the American Protective Association. The American Protective Association, what there's a question about on the test, was an organization that was committed to limiting immigration. Right? The American Protective Organization, committed to limiting immigration. Right? That was one response to dealing with the problems of the city, Sylvia. The problems are the people that are going there. And if we stop those people from going there, we'll stop the problems. The other approach was to try to deal with the circumstances. Who was Walter Russian Bush and Washington Gladden? We mentioned these two ministers in a context of something. Washington Russian Bush and, or excuse me, Walter Russian Bush and Washington Gladden. Who were they? Go ahead. Yes, they were associated with a movement called the social gospel. The social gospel was a religious argument that the problem of poverty was the result of circumstances rather than the people themselves. Who was Jane Addams and how did she fit into this kind of conversation? Go ahead, Joe. Jane Addams, 2Ds, was the person who established the first settlement house, Hull House, in Chicago. And what did that, what kind of activities? Yes?
They were basic services for the poor.
Yes. Social services for the poor, child care, instruction in English, cultural activities, lobbying for social reforms. They would not be involved specifically in religious activities, right? But they would provide social services for the impoverished people, the immigrants in the cities. Now, what was pragmatism? What was pragmatism? It was a philosophy, right? Who did we associate with it? Go ahead, Milady. William James. Now, Marissa, what did he say? William James.
Truth is what works.
Perfect. Truth is what works, right? Who else did we associate with pragmatism? John Dewey, who tried to apply that to education. Now, there are a few questions on the test about education that come out of chapter 25 in your textbook that we didn't talk about. One is about something called the Morel Act of 1862. The Morel Act of 1862. Now, the Morel Act of 1862 is most famous for granting land for the creation and the construction of universities to train people, public universities, to train people in individual states. Who loves Penn State? Juliet, you love Penn State? You go there? You've never been there? Who wants to drink the Kool-Aid in Penn State in 2 years? There you go. You want to drink the Kool-Aid up there? So the big Nittany line and the sign, I think it says, established at a certain... Penn State was a land-grant college. Wisconsin was a land-grant college. These were all colleges that were built for the purpose of supporting higher education. The government granted land for their establishment. Now, besides the government establishing or granting land for the establishment of land-grant colleges, the philanthropists, the great leaders of the Industrial Revolution of that time, also built universities. The two most famous are the University of Chicago. Who was that? Rockefeller. And one that's easy, Vanderbilt. You know, would be CMU would be another easy one. Carnegie Tech. Cornell was also built by a great philanthropist that endowed that university. Now, who are the two people? And this is kind of off of the subject because we talked about it today. Who were the two publishers that we associated with yellow journalism? Two publishers. Yes, go ahead. Hearst. William Randolph Hearst, right? Two publishers, Pulitzer and Hearst. And tell me just real fast, because yellow journalism is talked about in your textbook. It's mentioned in chapter 27, but it's talked about in more detail in chapter 25 in a section about literature and thinking and culture. And remember, in that section we talked about how industrialization and growth of big business changed how we think about things, right? And they mentioned Hearst there. And so, and Pulitzer there, and they mentioned yellow journalism, and we talked about it in context of the Spanish War. But remember, that's sensational embellishment in journalism, newspaper reporting. Now, we also talked about Henry George and Edward Bellamy. What was the name of Bellamy's book? Henry George and Edward Bellamy. What was the name of Bellamy's, got a pardon? Looking backward, right? And it looks backward to the year 2000, right? I mean, it looks forward to the year 2000, where America is a socialist utopia, where all of the great business concerns are owned for the public and run for the public good, right? And then Henry George, what did Henry George focus on? He had a focus. Do you remember what was the name of his book, Marissa? What was the name of his book? Poverty, Progress and Poverty. 1879 was about what? Go ahead. How do you say your first name? Sunny. Sunny. Right? That's what I thought. Sunny. Go ahead, Sunny. Say it.
It challenges the inequality that affects poverty.
What'd she say?
Challenges the inequality that affects poverty.
Yeah, yes, exactly. It challenged the necessity of inequality in terms of progress. And where did George believe that inequality came from? Yes. Property ownership, land ownership, right? Okay, we're getting there. Now, okay, that takes us to chapter 27. Stay with me. I know the hour is late. Let's just do a few more, right? So we did a little bit more of detail. This is going to be helpful. I know it is, right? Okay, so over the past couple of days, we've been talking about this transformation in attitude in terms of how we looked at the world. And, you know, we talked about the shift in foreign policy towards imperialism in the late 19th century. You know, we gave reasons for that. And one of the reasons that we gave, we said, involved the Turner Thesis. What was the Turner Thesis? And how did that promote American expansionism? The Turner Thesis. We put up on the board expansionism and imperialism, and then we had Christian missionary zeal, economic motives, we had military things, and then in the corner, yes, go ahead, Malay.
It was like Americans were successful because they conquered frontiers.
Yes. So then, what Malay said is that Americans, what Turner argued in his paper, the Turner Thesis, is what defined American history was conquest of the frontiers. What made us great, what made us special, what made us different was having to conquer frontiers. And in 1890, what did the Census Department announce? No, it announced the frontier was closed, right? So, you know, a closed frontier would justify expansion. Who was Alfred Thayer Mahan? Who was Alfred Thayer Mahan? Let's just do a few more. Alfred Thayer Mahan. Who was that? Yes. Yes, Alfred Thayer Mahan is associated with jingoism. He wrote a book. Stephanie, do you remember the name of the book?
The influence of sea power upon history.
I know you have extensive notes. The influence of sea power upon history. So, in that book, what did he advocate for, dear Stephanie?
The great power in history was the name of
Yes, a powerful, strong navy, which also would necessitate coaling stations, repair shops, and colonies. Note that when we kind of extend ourselves in the Spanish War, you know, and utilize our navy, the result of that is Guam. And even during the Spanish War, we didn't talk about this, but there's a question on the test. We annexed Hawaii, right? Guam, Hawaii, and the Philippines give us a presence in Asia, right? Which is going to be crucial to our commercial interests, right? Now, there is a discussion in your textbook about near conflicts that the United States has before the Spanish War. And one of them is the Venezuelan border dispute. And the Venezuelan border dispute involves Venezuela and Britain and Grover Cleveland. So I'm going to ask you to peek at that, right? Peek at the Venezuelan border dispute. Also, take a look at how Hawaii becomes part of the United States. Hawaii, there's two shots at Hawaii. I mean, American interests go to Hawaii, you know, pineapple growing interests, farming interests, sugar interests are in Hawaii. They attempt to get Hawaii annexed into the United States in the Grover Cleveland administration. Cleveland rejects it. But during the Spanish War, it's just annexed, right? Hawaii is annexed into the United States. Now, eventually, Hawaii is going to become a state, but not until the 1940s. Right? I don't know, say 1950s. Hawaii isn't really a state until the 1950s, nor is Alaska. You know, I mean, you know, so they were the last of, you know, the states to be annexed into the, or to be accepted into the Union. Now, the things that we talked about today, you know, we talked about, and just briefly, this will only take a second, and I promise I'll let you go. I know this is later than we usually stay. But, I mean, the transformation from American sympathy to intervention is greatly enhanced by the Maine, the sinking of the Maine. Now, why was the Maine there in the first place? Why was the Maine in Havana, however it is? To some extent, yes. It was there as a show of force, but potentially to evacuate American citizens if necessary. What could you say the main reason McKinley asked Congress to declare war on Spain because of? I mean, characterize after our conversation. Yeah, go ahead, Morel.
Oh, I don't know.
Because the public demanded it? I mean, is that a fair characterization of why McKinley did it? What was the Teller Amendment? What was the Teller Amendment? Go ahead, Morel.
It said that U.S. would not